We are back again with another Spearhead review, and I thought we would stick with the Stormcast theme for now and look at their other Spearhead that is available for players to use. This one features some of the slightly older 3rd edition models, and the Spearhead is Yndrasta's Spearhead. Now, this Spearhead is rather different to the previous one we looked at in that it seems really quite powerful on the face of it, but it does have quite a big caveat in that a chunk of it can't start on the board at the start of the battle. So you do have to be quite careful and plan your battle and your game out so that you can make the most out of your units. Otherwise, you will find that the force you have on the board from turn 1 can be wiped out potentially really fast, and then you will really struggle to claw back a win when the rest of your army shows up. So Yndrasta's Spearhead is made up of, naturally, Yndrasta herself, and she comes along with a Knight Vexilla with his fancy banner, 3 Annihilators, 2 units of 5 Vanquishers, and a Stormstrike Chariot. So it is a hefty 6 units in all. However, your battle trait is Scions of the Storm, and this trait means that Yndrasta and your Annihilators don't start on the board as normal. Instead, they are hanging out up in the heavens, and then you can drop them in on the board from the 3rd battle round onwards. So this is quite a big drawback. If you remember from the previous video, Spearhead only has 4 battle rounds. So essentially, you don't get to use 2 of your biggest, most powerful units for fully half the game, so it can be a massive hurdle to try and overcome. However, it's not all bad because you do get a way to make that pain a little bit less painful. You also get the ability Lightning Strike Arrival, and this is the next part of your battle trait, and this allows Yndrasta and your Annihilators, when they do come in battle round 3, to be set up anywhere on the battlefield that is more than 6 inches from enemies. So it's not the normal 9 inches, it is a much closer 6 inches, and this gives you a much better chance of being able to drop in and make that crucial, all-important charge into an enemy unit, so that you can get Yndrasta and the Annihilators into combat in battle round 3, rather than having them just stand around like lemons until the last turns of the game. Now, a 6-inch charge is around a 72% chance compared to the rather terrible 28% chance for a 9-inch charge, so it's still not guaranteed, don't get me wrong, you will absolutely still fail this sometimes, and that can really hurt your battle plans, but it's likely that when these 2 units come down, at least one of them will make a successful charge, and you've got a fairly good chance that both of them will. So being able to leverage that ability against 2 key enemy units that may be on an objective or in your way of scoring an important tactic for your army, it can definitely make this ability and make that weight worth it, because you can get them into combat so reliably and let them do all that damage that you need them to do without your opponent really being able to react. Now, in terms of the regiment abilities you get, because as you remember, you do get a choice of 2 regiment abilities as well. The first one is Drive Them Back. What this means is at the end of any turn, you can pick any number of friendly units contesting an objective and that are in combat, and they can each make a pile-in move, and then if they do so, you can pick an enemy unit within 1 inch of them and you roll a dice, and on a 4+ you do a mortal damage to them. So it's not an awful trait, the extra pile-in is really good and can be crucial, and whilst doing 1 mortal damage may not sound like much, it can actually add up in those smaller games of Spearhead and do, a good amount of damage to some of those smaller enemy units. Defend to the Last is a more defensive one, funnily enough. This one just gives your units a 6-up ward save when they are contesting an objective that you control. Now, I actually think that both of these are pretty good and viable. It really just depends whether you want to focus on your units on the board and just keep them alive as long as possible until Yndrasta comes along, or if you just want to wait, put all of your eggs in that one basket of Yndrasta and the Annihilators, and then really try to buff them up as much as you humanly can with those extra pile-ins and the mortal chip damage, and just really go in on those 2 units. They definitely both do have their uses and their pros and cons. I've tended to use Defend to the Last in most of my games with this Spearhead, but really, as I said, it does totally depend how defensively or aggressively you want to run this Spearhead. Of course, in addition to that, you get the usual choice of 4 enhancements. These do have to go on your general, who is Yndrasta, so they are just a buff to her. They come in the form of the Prime Huntress, which turns her spear Thengavar into a 2d6 damage weapon when she's fighting a monster. So that is seriously scary. Potentially doing 12 damage to an enemy monster will probably kill most of them. The big takeaway from this is that not every spearhead has monsters, so this can in some cases be quite limited in its effectiveness if you don't know what you're going up against. I mean, of course, you do get to choose this potentially after you've seen the enemy spearhead and seen how they're kind of setting up and everything. So you can, not choose this if there are no enemy monsters. It is very, very good if you see your opponent has a monster. Going for this one can make it so that Yndrasta is incredibly good at killing them. It just isn't as amazing because there are some matchups where you will just never want to take it because it won't actually do anything. Strike with the Tempest's Rage is another passive that just gives her strike first if she charges. This is always good when she drops in with her Annihilators, potentially letting you fight with both of them before the enemy can, so it can let you get a massive amount of damage into either two separate units or just utterly obliterate that one unit that maybe they both charge into. This is the one that I used when I was playing this Spearhead mostly, and I have to say I found that it worked pretty well most of the time, although I will also caveat that by saying I made every single 6-inch charge in all the games that I played with Yndrasta and the Annihilators, so it did actually have an impact every single game. You also get a choice of 2 which are once per battle instead if you want to go for those. Dazzling Radiance grants Yndrasta the ability to return 1 model to each friendly unit wholly within 12 inches of her on the turn she is set up. So she drops in, and then basically she can bring back 2 of your Vanquishers if any have been slain in either of the units. It's not awful. Essentially that can potentially get you 20% of your total Vanquisher models back if you set it up right. But of course it is also useless if they haven't taken any casualties by then, or instead they've been completely wiped out, because this doesn't let you bring a slain unit back at 1 model. It just lets you bring a model back to a unit that is still on the board. So it can be a bit luck dependent, but if you want to keep those Vanquishers as the main part of your force and keep them alive, this can help you do that a little bit more effectively. And then finally you have Hawk of the Celestial Skies. This is again once per battle in any combat phase. She can give +1 to hit rolls for friendly units wholly within 12 inches of her. So not only giving herself, but also potentially your Annihilators, your Vanquishers, maybe even the Chariot, if that is nearby, the ability to, for the most part, hit on 2s. So for that one brutal turn of damage output, this can be really strong. And certainly if she's charged in with the Annihilators, you can use this to make it so they can definitely kill whatever you are going into. And even if she just makes it in herself, she hits on 3s with her blade, so she will drop herself to hitting on 2s, which is really good with her otherwise pretty solid melee profile. So they all have some use. I would say, in my opinion, Prime Huntress is potentially the worst, but again, it's completely matchup dependent. If you go against a Spearhead that has a monster, you might think it's the best one for that potential 12 damage into them. But all of them have a good bit of potential, and again, they really do depend whether you want to play that more defensive style of game with this Spearhead, or just go all out in the damage and try to wipe out as much of the enemy as possible on a turn that Yndrasta arrives on the battlefield. Now, in terms of the actual units you get, as we saw in the previous Spearhead video, they are largely similar in terms of their overall stat line, but they get a few changes to things like their weapons and their abilities to account for the smaller size of Spearhead games. Yndrasta herself is still 8 health with a sweet 12-inch move, 3 up save and 2 control. However, her weapon options have changed a little. She does still get the ranged profile of Thengavar, which is 1 attack that hits on 3s, wounds on 2s with 2 rend and 4 damage, but it's no longer anti-monster +1 rend, so no extra bonus against monsters, but it's still a fairly scary ranged profile, especially if you make it 2d6 damage with the enhancement. That really can go a long way to killing those scary enemy monsters. However, then in melee, she's only got the Blade of the High Heavens now. You don't get the 2 extra attacks from Thengavar in combat, which is a shame, but still she has 5 attacks now that hit and wound on 3s with 2 rend and 3 damage, which for Spearhead is a very good little profile. She can pretty easily cut through most units that she comes into, especially when she is dropping in 6 inches away and then charging. she does put about 5 damage into a 4-up save unit, so it's really not too shabby for something like a Spearhead game. She's also got a base 6-up ward save to help keep her alive. This is a downgrade from the usual 5-up ward she has in regular AOS, but she does get a War Scroll ability which is Champion of Sigmar, and this gives her a once per battle 5-up ward. So you really can use this to get the most out of her for her short 2 turns you're going to be playing with her. She is very hard hitting, she can be very durable compared to a lot of other Spearhead units. So yes, whilst you only get to use her for half the game, she can be a very scary unit to drop in 6 inches away, charge into the enemy, and she can very much swing the battle on that turn that she drops in. Your other unit dropping in from the heavens is the Annihilators. These are still the same 3 health with their incredibly good 2-up save, and they still have the same 3 attacks each that hit and wound on 3s with 1 rend and 2 damage, which, like Yndrasta, is a pretty scary profile for Spearhead games. They do still only have their 4-inch move, so you definitely do want them to be making that 6-inch charge when they drop in, or else they can just be stuck in the middle of nowhere being avoided most of the game. So failing that charge can be fairly problematic on them. If you do have a reroll command on one of your tactics cards, it can be worth keeping hold of to save it for these guys, or maybe even save it for Yndrasta if you really want her to get in, so that if one of them does fail the charge, you can just use that to get another chance at rolling it. They also interestingly get the ability from the 2-handed version of the Annihilators instead of the brace for impact rule that the shielded ones get in regular AOS. They get Force of a Falling Star, and that grants an enemy unit strike last if these guys charge into them and roll an unmodified 8+. So it's not always going to go off, you only have around a 42% chance of rolling an 8+ on 2d6, but this can be quite handy if you want to try and get a couple of fights in before the enemy swings back. I would say overall it's not a great ability because it is just so unreliable, going off less than half the time, but at the same time, 9 2 damage attacks on such a durable unit that can potentially put strike last on the enemy is very, very good for Spearhead games, and they will still be pretty reliable at dropping in, going into combat, taking an objective from most targets that you go into, and then just holding it with that fantastic 2-up save against most things that you will find coming into them in Spearhead games. In terms of your units that actually start on the board, your Vanquishers are the same as regular AOS. They're 2 health, they have a 3-up save, they've got 2 attacks that are 3s and 3s, 1 rend and 1 damage, but then 2 damage against units of 5 or more models. This again is really good in Spearhead because most Spearheads will have at least one unit that has 5 or more models. In fact, I think every one of them, apart from maybe 1 or 2, like the Sons of Behemat and the Ogres, I'm pretty sure that every other Spearhead has at least 1 or 2 units of 5 or more models. So they will get some extra sweet damage in pretty much every single game that you play with this Spearhead. The big thing for these guys that you do need to be aware of is they don't have the reinforcements keyword. So unlike the other Stormcast Spearhead, what you bring in this Spearhead is what you get. Nothing comes back via reinforcements, and whilst there are a couple of command cards that get you to bring a unit back, or at least bring a few models back from a unit, that isn't always reliable. You aren't always going to draw it. So you do, as I said, really have to be careful about using this Spearhead and using these guys. You can't just throw them away for no reason and expect to get them back. Otherwise, you will have very little to score your tactics and capture objectives whilst you wait for Yndrasta and the Annihilators in Battle Round 3. The Vexilla is up next. He's a solid little mini hero for the Spearhead. He's got 6 health and a 3-up save, and he's got an okay profile, 4 attacks, 3s and 3s, 1 rend and 2 damage. So he's fairly good at fighting off smaller little units or going into other like mini characters like himself. He also does bring some healing to your army that is useful because of the no reinforcements. So whilst you wait for Yndrasta and the Annihilators, you can at least bring some health back to some of your units. You get to heal D3 to a target that is wholly within 12 inches of him in your hero phase. Now, he can't bring models back, he can't bring whole models back, but you can use this to heal up your chariot a bit, or just heal an injured Vanquisher back up to full wounds. And then, of course, when Yndrasta does come in, if she takes any damage in Battle Round 3, you can use him to top her back up as you go into Battle Round 4, just to make sure that she doesn't die if she's about to charge into another important enemy unit and try to win the game by killing them. And then finally, we have the Stormstrike Chariot. This, like in regular AOS, is a little bit rubbish. Now, you do have to take the Stormbow on it, you can't take the Spear, so it does bring the Spearhead a tiny bit more ranged output, but it's still only 2 attacks at 1 damage, so it's not really going to do anything. It's got 10 health and a 3-up save, so it can survive a little bit from some of the smaller units in Spearhead, but it's still really quite easy for most armies to take this out in 1 turn if you do charge it in recklessly. It still has the Azir Unleashed rule for some mortal damage on the charge. You can do up to D3 mortals on a 2+, and then you do have 9 attacks in melee, but they're all 1 damage and they're all -1 AP, or -1 Ren, should I say, so they're nothing super scary. I find this thing is good at either going off after a far off small unit that's holding a distant objective on the other end of the battlefield with its really good 10-inch move, which in Spearhead games is quite significant, or due to the smaller board sizes, it can actually be quite a good little blocking unit or roadblock for the rest of your units. It can be quite hard for your opponent to get to your Vexilla or your Vanquishers if you place this right and set it up so that it is blocking a charge lane to them. So if you really want to keep those units alive and just wait until turn 3 when Yndrasta and the Annihilators arrive and then unleash everything into the enemy at the same time, you can use this to keep those units alive, even if you do have to sacrifice it somewhat. Overall, it goes in with the theme of this Spearhead that you can play it aggressively or defensively. You do just need to be aware that it probably won't kill much. It can just be really good to potentially shove a lighter unit from an objective and maybe steal it for you, or get a tactic done if you draw a right card and you need to go after an objective that's on the other side of the board. Otherwise, I would just use it as a bit of a roadblock to keep the rest of your force alive until your reinforcements arrive from the heavens. And that is Yndrasta's Spearhead. Now, when I played it, I have to say I found it a bit trickier to use than the Vigilant Brotherhood. It was still very strong, and if you can survive and rack up a few points, then when Yndrasta and the Annihilators arrive on the board in Battle Round 3, it really is quite easy for them to just go after a key objective or tactic that you need to get, and they will almost certainly be able to grab it for you by wiping out a unit or just overpowering them on it so you can steal it. Especially if you've got a twist that gets you bonus points for killing a specific unit, this Spearhead can be really good at doing that. Getting that 6-inch deep strike, you really can quite reliably and easily go after a specific unit that you need to kill and quite reliably take it out with Yndrasta and the Annihilator's damage output. So it is good. You can potentially overplay it and sort of spread yourself out a bit too thin and then end up really suffering when Yndrasta and the Annihilators come in, especially if they then fail a charge that can completely scupper your plans. So I do think it's a bit less forgiving than the Vigilant Brotherhood, also because of the fact you don't have those reinforcements in case you do make any mistakes. But if you play it right and act a bit more defensively and then just wait for Yndrasta and the Annihilators to come in and unleash this big damaging wave in Battle Round 3, as long as you've scored a few points over the course of Battle Rounds 1 and 2, you can definitely then push the enemy back really far and just take complete control of the game for those last 2 turns. But as always, I'd love to know what you think of this Spearhead and how you think it compares to the Vigilant Brotherhood. Let me know all of your thoughts and how it's played out for you down in the comments below. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me. But until next time, I'll catch you later, guys.